Chairman.
Mr. Chair.
Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps I shouldn't be naive after the length of time I've had in this House, but I really hoped, on behalf of my constituents and the people in my city, that we would have seen a budget that confronted some of the pressing social problems that we are dealing with at the moment, and that today, under urgency, we would be working across the House together on legislation that would make a difference. Well, that was naive, wasn't it? It was naive, because what we've seen in this debate and from this minister today in his contribution is nothing more than double speak and spin. Talk about more flexible and innovative social housing. How does this bill create that, Minister? This is not about more innovative approaches. This is code for privatisation and opting out of the social responsibility that any government has to make sure that people have stable, decent homes where they can raise their kids in security and in warm and healthy housing. 80 years ago, this year, men and women sat in this House and debated legislation that did just that. We set up state housing because that was the guarantee that the lowest income people in the country, the most vulnerable people in the country, could still aspire to provide their kids with a decent home and a decent start in life. The Prime Minister should know that. That's how he got his start, and I'm proud that it was a Labor government that gave his family help when they needed. But what have we got now? A government that is ideologically driven, that now just wants to privatise state housing and opt out. Now, I talked about double-speak and Orwellian language. Take this from a statement that the minister put out in relation to this legislation, that this package was about supporting moves to housing independence. Independence is a wonderful thing, isn't it? What was she really saying, Mr. Chairman? She was talking about 3,000 eviction notices that will be given this year to those people who might just got their chin above the rising level of the cost of living and housing, and now they're out on the street and they're trying to find alternatives for their family. Talking about, as the minister did, more flexible and innovative social housing is simply to disguise a government that has given up, that is opting out of its social responsibility, and now wants to give these houses not to an organisation like the Salvation Army, as they promised before, but to property investors and developers that don't have the well-being of the poor and the vulnerable and the low income of this country at heart. And I want to ask the minister this question: what is there in this legislation that requires urgency today? What is it? What aspect requires us to rush through this House without the scrutiny of a select committee, the provisions in this bill today? Because I've read it backwards and forwards, Minister, and there is nothing there that requires urgency. You know why why we're doing this under urgency? Because this government does not want to subject its superficial legislation to the scrutiny of the public through a select committee. That's why we've got it in here today. And what evaluation has been done? The government is about to pass over the fundamental responsibility of providing social housing from an organisation that has had decades of experience and the flexibility of providing housing where and when it's needed. It's going to pass it over to the private sector. So I asked the Minister for Social Development, the Honourable Paula Bennett, this question under an OAA. What analysis has been done of the benefits or disadvantages of social housing being provided by NGOs, because I thought it was NGOs, not the private sector when I wrote the request, rather than through Housing New Zealand? Mr. Chairman, listen to this reply. Your request for analysis on the benefits or disadvantages of social housing being provided by NGOs rather than through Housing New Zealand is refused under Section 18E of the Official Information Act, as this information does not exist. You know what this answer says, Mr. Chairman? We've got a bill before the House that will privatise state housing, and no analysis has been done, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman, no analysis has been done by the government of the implications and the consequences of what it's rushing through this House without the benefit of scrutiny by a select committee. And if you have any doubts about that, just have a look at the departmental statement that accompanies this legislation, because it confirms that there is no evaluation and that not even Treasury has commented on this proposal. This proposal is not a serious governmental proposal. It's an ideological proposal by a government that pretends it's at the centre and throws a few coins to the poor when it suits them politically, but at the same time is undermining the ability of our community and our government to provide people with a fundamental housing need. I want to know from the Minister what this will do to increase the supply of social housing. Because when I looked at the figures, Minister, this government hasn't increased Housing New Zealand homes, it's cut it by 1,600 homes in the last 3 years. It slashed it. Now it wants to give away another couple of thousand houses to the private sector without knowing what's going to happen. And what is happening to our people on the ground that can be helped by this legislation? Our people on the ground are paying rents that have risen by $1,300 on average in the last year, $25 a week. Interesting figure, that $25 a week, isn't it? If you're a beneficiary, it's gone already. It's gone in rent increases, but actually it's not $25 a week. Read the fine print. If you're in a state house, a quarter of that goes anyway. $6.25 goes in increased rent for your state house. It's not $25 a week for them, it's about $18 or $19. And if you're in the private sector, your accommodation supplement is cut, giving on one hand and taking on the other. But going back to this legislation, nothing in this bill helps those people whose rents are going up 6 times the rate of overall inflation each year. There is a crisis of affordability for people to be able to get into homes, and this bill does nothing at all about that. Actually, think about the people at the bottom of the heap, because now who are they competing with? They're competing with 40% of the population who today have no chance of home ownership. Because you know what's happened in house prices, Mr Chairman, in Auckland? They've gone up 15%, $100,000 in the last year alone. $100,000. What pressure does that put on rent? And what pressure does that put on ordinary hard-working New Zealanders who actually want to buy their own home, who can't, who are now forced into the rental market and can outcompete the people at the bottom who previously at least could have looked to Housing New Zealand to provide them with housing security? Mr Speaker, Mr Chairman, there is a crisis in housing affordability in this country. Once upon a time, we could have guaranteed that an activist state would do something about that. Is this government, is this bill going to increase social housing by one house? The answer is no. The answer is no. It's likely to further reduce it. The government is opting out of its responsibility at the very time it should be stepping up to its responsibility. Because if we want kids that get good education, that are healthy kids, that starts in the home, and it starts with having a secure and a stable home and a warm and a healthy home. Traditionally, a government would say that Housing New Zealand had that responsibility. Housing New Zealand, in piece of legislation, one after the other, has had its role and its responsibility cut back. In this bill, it's not even going to be able to provide housing advice. Why would it waste its time for a government that has never listened to the advice? Because I know my Housing New Zealand people that provide the homes. I know the people in work and income that now allocate them. And if the minister went out from his ivory tower and listened to those people, he would understand that there is a crisis, and he would equally understand that there is nothing in this legislation that will go one iota towards resolving that crisis. This budget was a failure, and this bill is a failure in actually making a difference for a better New Zealand.
Dr. Megan Woods.